We know one of the reasons the Soviet Union dominated chess in the last century is because it was made up of multiple countries, not just Russia. And today we see a game between two of the best players from those other countries, even though this was played at the Soviet Championship in 1951. The first, familiar to, I'm sure, many of you, Tigran Petrosian from Armenia. His opponent, Isaac Lipnitsky, who was one of the top players in the Ukraine from the late 40s through the mid 50s, a master level player. And one interesting thing to watch in this game is how Petrosian plays a very unambitious opening, very simple, easy to learn, and then just presses by making high quality moves, a little bit more high quality than his opponents. Petrosian has the black pieces in this game, Lipnitsky has white. Let us jump right in. He begins with e4, Petrosian responds with e5, knight f3, knight c6, and bishop to c4. The Italian game is on the board. Now, usually black will respond with either knight to f6, the two knights defense, but white can go after the f7 pawn here. That's a main line. Or bishop to c5, just the traditional Juco piano, where black is controlling the d4 square. Now, Petrosian plays bishop to e7, or the Hungarian defense, not as well known. It controls g5, but allows d4, and white immediately plays d4 to break in the center and gain space. d6 from Petrosian, knight c3, knight to f6, h3, and castles. And here we have the opening. White slightly better, with a little bit more space, but only slightly. Castles. a6 from Petrosian, maybe he wants to kick that bishop, gain some space with b5. Maybe he just wants to keep a piece out of the b5 square. But white responds with a4, clamping down so that black cannot immediately play b5, but that weakens this b4 square. Petrosian takes note of that. First thing he does is capture on d4. White takes with the knight, and then knight to b4, taking advantage of that now softened square. So Petrosian presses on c2. I mean, it's not vulnerable right now, but just a little pressure, and adds to his control of the d5 square. Lipnitsky plays knight to d5. Petrosian goes ahead and takes that knight off of the board. Now, white could take with the bishop, but if he does, c6 would kick the bishop away, and then Petrosian would grab the e4 pawn, and it looks like he's just better here. That's just a fairly healthy pawn. So white goes ahead and takes with the pawn instead. Now, it does block the bishop for the time being, but the bishop can be rerouted to a better diagonal, and white has a little bit of space. Knight to d7. Now, this is a rerouting of Petrosian's pieces. The knight wants to go to d5, where it will be well placed and gain a tempo against the bishop, and also he frees the f6 square for his dark squared bishop. It can put some pressure on the diagonal. a5, clamping down so the knight can't go to b6, if that was his intention. Bishop to f6, and now c3 just to add a little bit more defense to the knight. Knight to e5 hits the bishop, and bishop to b3. Looks like this bishop wants to reroute at c2 where it can aim at Petrosian's king. So far, not much has changed. It's a symmetrical position. White has a little more space, a slight advantage. Rook to e8, moving the rook to the only open file on the board. Bishop c2. And here, it looks like what white wants to do is kick this knight, then play the queen to d3, where this queen and bishop battery will aim at the h7 square. Watch how Petrosian handles that. First, he plays bishop to d7, which is the only square that bishop can go to and not be immediately captured, just developing. f4 from white, dislodging the well-placed knight. Now, that's not a bad idea in and of itself, but white is going to have to be careful. This is a loosening of his position. The f4 pawn will be more vulnerable. The e3 square is loosened. So it's aggressive, but also he's going to have to be careful about it. Knight to g6, queen to d3, pressing on this long diagonal, pressing h7. And here Petrosian makes what I think is the most important move of the game overall. He plays this move, c5. And he has to gain his share of the center. Even if he started without his share of the center, he has to fight for it. And what he does here is give white a choice. Either he can allow his well-placed knight to be dislodged, right, which would, of course, further accentuate this bishop's pressure, or he can take en passant, which is what he does, but then White's space advantage that he had with d5 is no longer there, and Petrosian has these two pawns that he can use to gain central space. And that is what happened in the game. Here at knight to f5 is played by White, obviously coming in, aiming at this d6 pawn and square. So Petrosian goes ahead and takes it off the board. And now White does have the bishop pair, but Black has this nice set of pawns in the center that he can gain space with, which he immediately does. And that's sort of where this position, the tension is at the moment. The bishop pair versus the nice space advantage for Black. Bishop d2, just getting the bishop off the back rank. It obviously can't develop to e3 because the rook would take it because this pawn advanced. So e3 was vulnerable. Now, key move from Petrosian. Knight to f8. The knight defends h7, but from f8, where it's very hard to dislodge. There's the saying that with a knight on f8, you will never get mated. I think John Nunn is usually attributed with that quote. Some of you may know better than that, but I think that's right. A knight on f8, you'll never get mated. So it's going to be very hard for White to get at this h7 square. The queen goes back to d3, and now c5. Petrosian uses what is his strength, gaining space in the center of the board. Rook f to e1. Pair of rooks come off. He can't take with the rook, which he would like to do to gain control of the open file, because then he would lose the a5 pawn. So White has to take with the bishop. c4, gaining even more space. And he would like to probably advance here with d4 and break open that center, accentuate the bishop's pressure on b2, which is now a backwards pawn because this pawn is on c4. Queen to e2, queen to c7, keeping pressure on a5 and threatening to take f4, that loosening a move. Queen to f3 defends f4, but also counterattacks the pawn at d5. So rook to d8 not only defends that pawn, but prepares to advance it, move it up the board. Bishop to f2 to control the square in front of the pawn, but he doesn't have enough to win it. So Petrosian goes ahead and plays d4. Now, if White were to just take it, that wouldn't be bad, actually. This is probably equal, but it looks to me like Black is having a little more fun here. He's got a target on f4, b2, and a5, and even though he has his weaknesses and the knight probably isn't as good as the bishop, Lipnitsky did not want to go into this position. So what he did instead is play queen to e4. Now remember, he's not threatening mate because the knight is defending this square, but he is adding some pressure to this square. And again, it looks natural to play d3. That's fine. But Petrosian does not do that, probably because of this move, bishop to b6, skewering the queen and rook. After queen to b8, he can't take the rook, because after queen takes b2, Black is just winning, threatening the rook, the bishop. With this pawn coming in, Black would just be winning. But after bishop to a4, controlling this key diagonal, White still has a decent position. So what Petrosian does instead is play g6. Now this diagonal is really limited. He's definitely not going to get mated on h7 now. Now White goes ahead and takes on d4, and Petrosian does not retake. The pawn is sufficiently defended, but instead plays rook to b8, aiming at this weakness at b2. And the only way to really comfortably defend that would be to play rook to a2, but now this rook is very passive. And Petrosian could play knight to e6, hitting f4, and Black has very good compensation in a position like this. He's doing fine. So because of that, Lipnitsky decides to give up that pawn and use his own d pawn, which is the strongest element of his position, and try to advance it up the board, like you might in the Grunfeld system. Rook takes b2, rook to d1, putting all of his force behind that d pawn, and it looks very dangerous. c3, d6. Petrosian goes ahead and takes that pawn. He's taking material, but he does have to worry about this pawn advancing. A very dangerous pawn, now only one square away from queening. But Petrosian knew that. He saw this position and was prepared to defend here. Queen to c7 helps keep control over this square and also defend the c3 pawn. Queen to e8. The queen helps control the pawn's movement to the queening square. And now bishop to d8, creating an actual peace blockade on that queening square. queen to e4, bishop goes back to f6. Now, queen e8. Looks like white would be okay with a draw with a repetition of moves, but Petrosian is not, and he plays the rook back instead of the bishop. Rook to b8 to help the rook hit the queen and control the queening square. Now, what looks best for white here, and this is an important variation to look at to understand what happens, is bishop to a4, sort of helping back all of this up, defend this pawn. And the reason is after the natural move c2, bishop can take c2, queen c2, then white can queen here, and after pieces get exchanged, even though black is up a pawn, the problem is that he's so weak on these dark squares, and white still has a dark squared bishop. It's going to be very hard for black to win this position. Very, very hard. But instead, white plays the move king to h1, which loses a tempo. And knowing that previous variation, Petrosian plays the move rook to d8. Key move. And he's surrounding this pawn. And now Lipnitsky plays bishop to a4. But now things are different than they were in the variation we just saw. Petrosian plays c2, and here, if white takes the pawn, then queen can just take the pawn, and that's it. Because this rook is sitting on this square, black is threatening the rook, it would just cost white a piece. So he can't take the pawn. So Lipnitsky plays rook to c1. Obviously, the rook was threatened, and he wants to take back on c2. But now queen to f4. After all of that time, that loosening move f4 came back to bite white. And here we see a triple attack. He's hitting the rook at c1, the bishop at f2, and the bishop at a5. And when it's a triple attack, there's really no way to defend all of it. Lipnitsky plays bishop to e3, defended by the queen. That saves this bishop and this rook. But there's nothing he can do about that last piece. After queen takes a5, Petrosian wins the game. An unambitious opening, but a series of very high-quality moves, and that was the difference. Hope you enjoyed this game. See you again soon at Chess Dog. Goodbye.